Cuban Revolution. Published March the 24th, 2018. Further information found at the end of this recording. The Cuban Revolution was an armed revolt conducted by Fidel Castro's revolutionary 26th of July movement and its allies against the authoritarian government of Cuban President Fulgencio Batista. The revolution began in July 1953 and continued sporadically until the rebels finally ousted Batista on the 1st of January 1959, replacing his government with a revolutionary socialist state. The 26th of July 1959 is celebrated in Cuba as the Day of the Revolution. The 26th of July movement later reformed along communist lines, becoming the Communist Party in October 1965. The Cuban Revolution had powerful domestic and international repercussions. In particular, it transformed Cuba's relationship with the United States, although efforts to improve diplomatic relations have gained momentum in recent years. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, Castro's government began a program of nationalization and political consolidation that transformed Cuba's economy and civil society. The revolution also heralded an era of Cuban intervention in foreign military conflicts, including the Angolan Civil War and the Nicaraguan Revolution. Part 1: History and Origins. In the decades following United States invasion of Cuba in 1898 and formal independence from the U.S. on May 20, 1902, Cuba experienced a period of significant instability, enduring a number of revolts, coups and a period of U.S. military occupation. Fulgencio Batista, a former soldier who had served as the elected president of Cuba from 1940 to 1944, became president for the second time in 1952, after seizing power in a military coup and cancelling the 1952 elections. Although Batista had been relatively progressive during his first term, in the 1950s he proved far more dictatorial and indifferent to popular concerns. While Cuba remained plagued by high unemployment and limited water infrastructure, Batista antagonized the population by forming lucrative links to organized crime and allowing American companies to dominate the Cuban economy, especially sugarcane plantations and other local resources. Although the U.S. armed and politically supported the Batista dictatorship, later U.S. presidents recognized its corruption and the justifiability of removing it. During his first term as president, Batista had been supported by the Communist Party of Cuba, but during his second term he became strongly anti-communist, gaining him political and military support from the United States. Batista developed a powerful security infrastructure to silence political opponents. In the months following the March 1952 coup, Fidel Castro, then a young lawyer and activist, petitioned for the overthrow of Batista, whom he accused of corruption and tyranny. However, Castro's constitutional arguments were rejected by the Cuban courts. After deciding that the Cuban regime could not be replaced through legal means, Castro resolved to launch an armed revolution. To this end, he and his brother Raúl founded a paramilitary organization known as the Movement, stockpiling weapons and recruiting around 1,200 followers from Havana's disgruntled working class by the end of 1952. Part 2. Early stages. Striking their first blow against the Batista government, Fidel and Raúl Castro gathered 123 movement fighters and planned a multi-pronged attack on several military installations. On the 26th of July 1953, the rebels attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago and the barracks in Bayamo, only to be decisively defeated by government soldiers. It was hoped that the staged attack would spark a nationwide revolt against Batista's government. He had around 150 factory and farm workers. After an hour of fighting, the rebel leader fled to the mountains. The exact number of rebels killed in the battle is debatable. However, in his autobiography, Fidel Castro claimed that 9 were killed in the fighting, and an additional 56 were executed after being captured by the Batista government. Due to the government's large number of men, Hunt revised the number to be around 60 members, taking the opportunity to flee to the mountains along with Castro. Among the dead was Abel Santamaria, Castro's second-in-command, who was imprisoned, tortured, and executed on the same day as the attack. Numerous key movement revolutionaries, including the Castro brothers, were captured shortly afterwards. In a highly political trial, Fidel spoke for nearly 4 hours in his defense, ending with the words, "Condemn me, it does not matter. History will absolve me." Castro's defense was based on nationalism, the representation and beneficial programs for the non-elite Cubans, and his patriotism and justice for the Cuban community. Fidel was sentenced to 15 years in the Presidio Modelo prison, located on Isla de Pinos, while Raúl was sentenced to 13 years. However, in 1955, under broad political pressure, the Batista government freed all political prisoners in Cuba, including the Moncada attackers. Fidel's Jesuit childhood teachers succeeded in persuading Batista to include Fidel and Raúl in the release. Soon, the Castro brothers joined with other exiles in Mexico to prepare for the overthrow of Batista, receiving training from Alberto Bayo, a leader of Republican forces in the Spanish Civil War. In June 1955, Fidel met the Argentine revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara, who joined his cause. Raúl and Castro's chief advisor Ernesto aided the initiation of Batista's amnesty. The revolutionaries named themselves the 26th of July movement, in reference to the date of their attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953. Part 3, Guerrilla Warfare. The yacht Granma departed from Tuxpan, Veracruz, Mexico, on the 25th of November 1956, carrying the Castro brothers and 80 others including Ernesto Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, even though the yacht was only designed to accommodate 12 people with a maximum of 25. The yacht arrived in Cuba on the 2nd of December. The boat landed in Playa Las Coloradas, in the municipality of Niquero, arriving 2 days later than planned because the boat was heavily loaded, unlike during the practice sailing runs. This dashed any hopes for a coordinated attack with the Llano wing of the movement. After arriving and exiting the ship, the band of rebels began to make their way into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, a range in southeastern Cuba. 3 days after the trek began, Batista's army attacked and killed most of the Granma, the participants. While the exact number is disputed, no more than 20 of the original 82 men survived the initial encounters with the Cuban army and escaped into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. The group of survivors included Fidel and Raúl Castro, Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos. The dispersed survivors, alone or in small groups, wandered through the mountains, looking for each other. Eventually, the men would link up again with the help of peasant sympathizers and would form the core leadership of the guerrilla army. A number of female revolutionaries, including Celia Sanchez and Haydee Santamaria, the sister of Abel Santamaria, also assisted Fidel Castro's operations in the mountains. On the 13th of March 1957, a separate group of revolutionaries, the Anti-Communist Student Revolutionary Directorate ARDI, Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, DRE, composed mostly of students, stormed the presidential palace in Havana, attempting to assassinate Batista and decapitate the government. The attack ended in utter failure. The RDS leader, student Jose Antonio Echeverria, died in a shootout with Batista's forces at the Havana radio station he had seized to spread the news of Batista's anticipated death. The handful of survivors included Dr. Humberto Costello, who later became the Inspector General in the Escambray, Rolando Cabela and 4 chairmen, both later commandantes of the 13th of March movement, centered in the Escambray Mountains of Las Villas province. Thereafter, the United States imposed an economic embargo on the Cuban government and recalled its ambassador, weakening the government's mandate further. Batista's support among Cubans began to fade, with former supporters either joining the revolutionaries or distancing themselves from Batista. Once Batista started making drastic decisions concerning Cuba's economy, he began to nationalize U.S. oil refineries and other U.S. properties. Nonetheless, the mafia and U.S. businessmen maintained their support for the regime. Batista's government often resorted to brutal methods to keep Cuba's cities under control. However, in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, Castro, aided by Frank Pace, Ramos Latour, Hugo Matos, and many others, staged successful attacks on small garrisons of Batista's troops. In addition, poorly armed irregulars known as escopeteros harassed Batista's forces in the foothills and plains of Oriente province. The escopeteros also provided direct military support to Castro's main forces by protecting supply lines and by sharing intelligence. Ultimately, the mountains came under Castro's control. In addition to armed resistance, the rebels sought to use propaganda to their advantage. A pirate radio station called Radio Rebel Radio was set up in February 1958, allowing Castro and his forces to broadcast their message nationwide within enemy territory. Castro's affiliation with the New York Times, journalist Herbert Matthews created a front page where they report on anti-communist propaganda. The radio broadcasts were made possible by Carlos Franchi, a previous acquaintance of Castro who subsequently became a Cuban exile in Puerto Rico. During this time, Castro's forces remained quite small in numbers, sometimes fewer than 200 men, while the Cuban army and police force had a manpower of around 37,000. Even so, nearly every time the Cuban military fought against the revolutionaries, the army was forced to retreat. An arms embargo imposed on the Cuban government by the United States on the 14th of March 1958 contributed significantly to the weakness of Batista's forces. The Cuban Air Force rapidly deteriorated. It could not repair its airplanes without importing parts from the United States. Batista finally responded to Castro's efforts with an attack on the mountains called Operation Verano, known to the rebels as La Ofensiva. The army sent some 12,000 soldiers, half of them untrained recruits, into the mountains, along with his own brother Raúl. In a series of small skirmishes, Castro's determined guerrillas defeated the Cuban army. In the Battle of La Plata, which lasted from the 11th of July to the 21st of July 1958, Castro's forces defeated a 500-man battalion, capturing 240 men while losing just 3 of their own. However, the tide nearly turned on the 29th of July 1958, when Batista's troops almost destroyed Castro's small army of some 300 men at the Battle of Las Mercedes. With his forces pinned down by superior numbers, Castro asked for, and received, a temporary ceasefire on the 1st of August. Over the next 7 days, while fruitless negotiations took place, Castro's forces gradually escaped from the trap. By the 8th of August, Castro's entire army had escaped back into the mountains, and Operation Verano had effectively ended in failure for the Batista government. Part 4, Final Offensive and Rebel Victory. On the 21st of August 1958, after the defeat of Batista's Ofensiva, Castro's forces began their own offensive. In the Oriente province in the area of the present-day provinces of Santiago de Cuba, Granma, Guantánamo and Holguin, Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro and Juan Almeida Bosque directed attacks on 4 fronts, descending from the mountains with new weapons captured during the offensiva and smuggled in by plane. Castro's forces won a series of initial victories. Castro's major victory at Guiza, and the successful capture of several towns including Mafo, Contramaestre, and Central Oriente, brought the Cuarto Plains under his control. Meanwhile, 3 rebel columns, under the command of Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos and Jaime Vega, proceeded westward toward Santa Clara, the capital of Villa Clara province. Batista's forces ambushed and destroyed Jaime Vega's column, but the surviving 2 columns reached the central provinces, where they joined forces with several other resistance groups not under the command of Castro. When Che Guevara's column passed through the province of Las Villas, and specifically through the Escambray Mountains, where the anti-communist Revolutionary Directorate forces who became known as the 13th of March movement had been fighting Batista's army for many months. Friction developed between the two groups of rebels. Nonetheless, the combined rebel army continued the offensive, and Cienfuegos won a key victory in the Battle of Yaguayi on the 30th of December 1958, earning him the nickname, the Hero of Yaguayi. On the 31st of December 1958, the Battle of Santa Clara took place in a scene of great confusion. The city of Santa Clara fell to the combined forces of Che Guevara, Cienfuegos, and Revolutionary Directorate RD rebels led by Comandantes Rolando Cabello, Juan El Mexicano Abrahantes, and William Alexander Morgan. News of these defeats caused Batista to panic. He fled Cuba by air for the Dominican Republic just hours later on the 1st of January 1959. Comandante William Alexander Morgan, leading RD rebel forces, continued fighting as Batista departed, and had captured the city of Cienfuegos by the 2nd of January. Castro learned of Batista's flight in the morning and immediately started negotiations to take over Santiago de Cuba. On the 2nd of January, the military commander in the city, Colonel Rubido, ordered his soldiers not to fight, and Castro's forces took over the city. The forces of Guevara and Cienfuegos entered Havana at about the same time. They had met no opposition on their journey from Santa Clara to Cuba's capital. Castro himself arrived in Havana on the 8th of January after a long victory march. His initial choice of president, Manuel Urrutia, took office on the 3rd of January. Part 5. Women's Roles in the Revolution. The importance of women's contributions to the Cuban Revolution is reflected in the very accomplishments that allowed the revolution to be successful, from the participation in the Moncada barracks, to the Mariana Greyjoys all-women's platoon that served as Fidel Castro's personal security detail. Tet Puebla, second in command of the Mariana Greyjoys platoon, has said, "Women in Cuba have always been on the front line of the struggle. At Moncada we had Hedy Santa Maria and Melba Hernandez. With the Gran Mayotte and November 30th, we had Celia, Vilma, and many other compañeras. There were many women comrades who were tortured and murdered. From the beginning there were women in the Revolutionary Armed Forces. First they were simple soldiers, later sergeants. Those of us in the Mariana Greyjoys platoon were the first officers. The ones who ended the war with officers' ranks stayed in the armed forces. Before the Mariana Greyjoys platoon was established, the revolutionary women of the Sierra Maestra were not organized for combat and primarily helped with cooking, mending clothes, and tending to the sick, frequently acting as couriers, as well as teaching guerrillas to read and write. Hedy Santa Maria and Melba Hernandez were the only women who participated in the attack on the Moncada barracks, afterward acting alongside Natalia Revuelta and Lydia Castro, Fidel Castro's sister, to form alliances with anti-Batista organizations, as well as the assembly and distribution of History Will Absolve Me. Celia Sanchez and Vilma Espin were leading strategists and highly skilled combatants who held essential roles throughout the revolution. Tet Puebla, founding member and second in command of the Mariana Greyjoys platoon, said of Celia Sanchez, "When you speak of Celia, you've got to speak of Fidel, and vice versa." Celia's ideas touched almost everything in the Sierra. Part 6. Aftermath. On the 15th of April 1959, Castro began an 11-day visit to the United States, at the invitation of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. He said during his visit, "I know the world thinks of us, we are communists, and of course I have said very clear that we are not communists, very clear." Hundreds of Batista-era agents, policemen and soldiers were put on public trial, accused of human rights abuses, war crimes, murder, and torture. About 200 of the accused people were convicted of political crimes by revolutionary tribunals and then executed by firing squad. Others received long sentences of imprisonment. A notable example of revolutionary justice occurred after the capture of Santiago, where Raúl Castro directed the execution of more than 70 Batista POWs. For his part in taking Havana, Che Guevara was appointed supreme prosecutor in La Habana fortress. This was part of a large-scale attempt by Fidel Castro to cleanse the security forces of Batista loyalists and potential opponents of the new revolutionary government. Though many were killed or imprisoned, others were fortunate enough to be dismissed from the army and police without prosecution, and some high-ranking officials of the Batista administration were exiled as military attaches. Most scholars agree that those executed were probably guilty as accused, but the trials did not follow due process. Chapter 1: Reforms and Nationalization. During its first decade in power, the Castro government introduced a wide range of progressive social reforms. Laws were introduced to provide equality for black Cubans and greater rights for women, while there were attempts to improve communications, medical facilities, health, housing, and education. In addition, there were touring cinemas, art exhibitions, concerts, and theaters. By the end of the 1960s, all Cuban children were receiving some education compared with less than half before 1959. Unemployment and corruption were reduced, and great improvements were made in hygiene and sanitation. According to geographer and Cuban Comandante Antonio Núñez Jiménez, 75% of Cuba's best arable land was owned by foreign individuals or foreign, mostly American companies at the time of the revolution. One of the first policies of the newly formed Cuban government was eliminating illiteracy and implementing land reforms. Land reform efforts helped to raise living standards by subdividing larger holdings into cooperatives. Comandante Sorimbarin, who was nominally in charge of land reform, objected and fled, but was eventually executed when he returned to Cuba with arms and explosives, intending to overthrow the Castro government. Shortly after taking power, Castro also created a revolutionary militia to expand his power base among the former rebels and the supportive population. Castro also created the Informant Committees for the Defense of the Revolution (CDRs) in late September 1960. Local CDRs were tasked with keeping vigilance against counter-revolutionary activity, keeping a detailed record of each neighborhood's inhabitants' spending habits, level of contact with foreigners, work and education history, and any suspicious behavior. Among the increasingly persecuted groups were homosexual men. In February 1959, the Ministry for the Recovery of Misappropriated Assets, Ministerio de Recuperación de Bienes Malversados, was created. Cuba began expropriating land and private property under the auspices of the Agrarian Reform Law of the 17th of May 1959. Farms of any size could be and were seized by the government, while land, businesses, and companies owned by upper and middle-class Cubans were nationalized, notably, including the plantations owned by Fidel Castro's family. By the end of 1960, the revolutionary government had nationalized more than $25 billion worth of private property owned by Cubans. The Castro government formally nationalized all foreign-owned property, particularly American holdings, in the nation on the 6th of August 1960. In 1961, the Cuban government nationalized all property held by religious organizations, including the dominant Roman Catholic Church. Hundreds of members of the church, including a bishop, were permanently expelled from the nation, as the new Cuban government declared itself officially atheist. Education also saw significant changes. Private schools were banned and the progressively socialist state assumed greater responsibility for children. The Cuban government also began to expropriate from mafia leaders and taking millions in cash. Before Lansky fled Cuba, he was said to be worth an estimated $20 million. That would be $163,685,121 in 2016. When he died in 1983, his family was shocked that his estate was worth less than $10,000. Before he died, Lansky said Cuba ruined him. In July 1961, the Integrated Revolutionary Organizations (IRO) was formed by the merger of Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement, the People's Socialist Party led by Blas Roca, and the Revolutionary Directorate of the 13th of March led by Fochoman. On the 26th of March 1962, the IRO became the United Party of the Cuban Socialist Revolution PURSC, which, in turn, became the modern Communist Party of Cuba on the 3rd of October 1965, with Castro as first secretary. Castro remained the ruler of Cuba, first as prime minister and, from 1976, as president, until his retirement in February 2008. His brother Raúl officially replaced him as president later that same month. Chapter 2. International Reactions and Foreign Policy. The Cuban Revolution was a crucial turning point in U.S.-Cuban relations. Although the American government was initially willing to recognize Castro's new government, it soon came to fear that communist insurgencies would spread through the nations of Latin America, as they had in Southeast Asia. Castro, meanwhile, resented the Americans for providing aid to Batista's government during the revolution. After the revolutionary government nationalized all U.S. property in Cuba in August 1960, the American Eisenhower administration froze all Cuban assets on American soil, severed diplomatic ties and tightened its embargo of Cuba. In 1961, the U.S. government backed an armed counter-revolutionary assault on the Bay of Pigs with the aim of ousting Castro, but the counter-revolutionaries were swiftly defeated by the Cuban military. The American embargo against Cuba, the longest-lasting single foreign policy in American history, is still in force as of 2017, although it has undergone a partial loosening in recent years. The U.S. began efforts to normalize relations with Cuba in the mid-2010s, and formally reopened its embassy in Havana after over half a century in August 2015. Castro's victory and post-revolutionary foreign policy had global repercussions. Influenced by the expansion of the Soviet Union into Europe after the 1917 Russian Revolution, Castro immediately sought to export his revolution to other countries in the Caribbean and beyond, sending weapons to Algerian rebels as early as 1960. In the following decades, Cuba became heavily involved in supporting communist insurgencies and independence movements in many developing countries, sending military aid to insurgents in Ghana, Nicaragua, Yemen and Angola, among others. Castro's intervention in the Angolan Civil War in the 1970s and 1980s was particularly significant, involving as many as 60,000 Cuban soldiers. Following the American embargo, the Soviet Union became Cuba's main ally. The two communist countries quickly developed close military and intelligence ties, culminating in the stationing of Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba in 1962, an act which triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba maintained close links to the Soviets until the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. The end of Soviet economic aid led to an economic crisis and famine known as the Special Period in Cuba. Chapter 3. Exiles and counter-revolutionary rebels. In the wake of the revolution, thousands of disaffected anti-Batista rebels, former Batista supporters, and campesinos peasants fled to Cuba's Las Villas province, where an anti-communist underground had been forming since early 1960. Operating out of the Escambray Mountains, these counter-revolutionary rebels, also known as alzados, made a number of unsuccessful attempts to overthrow the Cuban government, including the abortive, United States-backed Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961. In the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the United States promised not to invade Cuba in the future. In compliance with this agreement, the U.S. withdrew all support from the alzados, effectively crippling the resource-starved resistance. The counter-revolutionary conflict, known abroad as the Escambray Rebellion, lasted until about 1965, and has since been branded the war against the bandits by the Cuban government. Between 1959 and 1980, an estimated 500,000 Cubans left the island for the United States for both political and economic reasons. 125,000 left in 1980 alone, when the Cuban government briefly permitted any Cubans who wished to leave to do so. By 2010, the Cuban American community numbered over 1.9 million, 67% of whom lived in the state of Florida. As a voting bloc, Cuban Americans have traditionally been strongly opposed to ending the U.S. embargo of Cuba, but in recent years there has been growing support for diplomatic engagement among the younger generations. Part 7. In popular culture. I Am Cuba is a 1964 Soviet-Cuban film that consists of 4 distinct short stories about the suffering of the Cuban people before the revolution. The Cuban Revolution, including Batista's resignation and flight into exile, plays a major role in the plot of the 1974 film The Godfather Part II. The 1987 video game, Guevara, released in the United States as Guerrilla War, features Castro and Guevara fighting in the jungle against the forces of an unnamed dictator. The Cuban dissident and exile Reynaldo Arenas wrote about Castro's persecution of homosexuals in his 1992 autobiography, Antes Guernica, which became the basis for the 2000 film Before Night Falls. The 2004 film Dirty Dancing, Havana Nights, takes place during the final weeks of Batista's reign, culminating with the flight of Batista on January 1, 1959. Steven Soderbergh's 2008 film Che, a 2-part biopic about Che Guevara, depicts the rise of Castro's movement and Guevara's role in the Cuban Revolution. The 2010 video game Call of Duty Black Ops features a level set in Havana in 1961, in which players must attempt to assassinate Castro. The level was condemned by the Cuban government. The 2013 strategic board game Cuba Libre by U.S. wargaming publisher GMT Games puts players into the roles of the involved parties in the revolution and lets them reenact the conflict alongside a randomized storyline of the key historical events. The 2009 video game Godfather II begins in Havana on December 31, 1958, roughly 3 years after the closing events of the previous game, The Godfather. The character Hyman Roth calls a meeting in Cuba to celebrate the Mafia's success in their partnership with the government of Fulgencio Batista. However, later that night, Batista resigns from office, as the Cuban Revolution proves victorious, and the plot continues from that point. This recording is a derivative work from Wikipedia. For more information, to commission recordings like this, and to support the developer, please visit www.patreon.com/frogcast.